Okay, so in this video, we're going to be talking about factor by grouping. And there's a couple of steps you want to know before you factor by grouping, and I wrote them down here. It's pretty straightforward. Let's go over these 4 steps that you have to remember, and then we'll start doing some problems. Step 1, make sure you have 4 terms. So in order to do factor by grouping, you have to make sure that you have 4 terms. If you do not have 4 terms, you cannot factor by grouping, okay? Step 2, group together the first 2 terms and then group together the last 2 terms. So once you identify that you have 4 terms, you want to group together the first 2 and then you group together the last 2, okay? Step 3, pull out the greatest common factor from each grouping. So you want to pull out a greatest common factor from your first grouping and then your last grouping. And then step 4, write the common factor one time and then the outside values as a factor. So here's our first example, and they want us to go ahead and factor this expression. And your first step, do you have 4 terms? And the answer is you do. So you could possibly factor by grouping here. Now on all of these examples in this video, you are going to be able to factor by grouping. You're going to end up with a common factor at the end. But just keep in mind, just because you have 4 terms does not mean it's always going to work out. And I'll show you how you know if it's going to work or if it's not going to work. All right. So step 1, group together the first 2 and then group together the last 2, just like that. Okay. Now we want to pull out a greatest common factor between both. So working on my first grouping here, what can I pull out? What do they both have in common? Well, they both have a 3 in common, and they also have an x squared in common. So I can pull out a 3x squared, okay? And then in parentheses, I will have 6x, and then I'll have plus 7, okay? There it is. Now I'm going to go on to my next grouping. I have 48x plus 56. What can I pull out? What do they have in common? Well, it looks like they have an 8 in common, so I can go ahead and pull out an 8, so plus 8. And then I'll have, in parentheses, 6x plus 7. So I'm going to stop right here because what do you notice? Well, you have a common factor. My common factor is right here, okay, and also right here. So if you do the problem correctly, you should end with a common factor. If you don't do it correctly, you are not going to have a common factor here. And honestly, you could be doing it correctly, but you just may not be able to factor by grouping. So if you cannot get a common factor, then you cannot factor by grouping. But again, like I told you at the beginning, all of these examples in this video, you are going to be able to factor by grouping. So this common factor that you have here is like your confirmation. This is our confirmation that yes, we can factor by grouping. And at this point here, you're pretty much done. So to factor it, you just write the common factor one time, 6x plus 7. And then you write your outside values together. So my outside values going left to right, I have 3x squared and then plus 8. So in parentheses, I'm going to put 3x squared and then plus 8. All right, and that is it. So this problem's done. We just went ahead and factored it. And again, we did that by factoring by grouping. All right, let's go ahead and try another example. So here's my next example. Do I have 4 terms? I do. So, okay, we can try factor by grouping. So I'm going to group together the first 2 and then the last 2. What can I pull out between the first 2 terms? Well, they have a 3 in common. They also have an m squared. Okay, so that leaves me inside parentheses 4m and then minus 5. Okay, now we go on to our last 2 terms. What do they have in common? Well, it looks like they have a 4 in common. So pull out a positive 4, and then in parentheses, I'll have 4m minus 5. Okay, so did we do it correctly? Yes, we did, because we have a common factor. Okay, right here and here. So now all we have to do is put it in factored form, write the common factor one time, 4m minus 5, and then again, your outside values together going left to right. So 3m squared and then plus 4. Okay, and that's done. And just remember, it doesn't matter the order that you're writing these factors. Like I could have written this factor first if I wanted to, because I'm multiplying and I can multiply in any order. So the order of the factors does not matter. Okay. But this problem is now complete. All right, so there it is, completely factored. All right, let's try 2 more problems. So here's my next example. Do I have 4 terms? I do. All right, let's try to factor by grouping. We're going to group together the first 2 and then the last 2. So what can I pull out between my first 2 terms? I can pull out an x squared. So x squared, in parentheses, I'll have 2x and then minus 7. Okay, What can I pull out between those last two terms? Well, I can pull out a 5. Now, what happens if I pull out a positive 5? If I pull out a positive 5, what happens with my factor? Well, I'm going to get negative 2x and then plus 7. So what do you notice here? You do not have a common factor because this is negative 2x, this one's positive 2x. This is positive 7, this is negative 7. So I do not have a common factor here, but how can I get around that? Well, instead of pulling out a positive 5, you want to pull out a negative 5, and that will change the signs here, giving you that common factor that you need. So just going back, we're going to pull out a negative 5 instead, not a positive 5, and that should take care of the issue. Now we have 2x minus 7, and that will work, okay? So again, just be aware of that. You may have to pull out a negative, not a positive, and then your common factor will indeed work, okay? So I have my common factor. Let's write it one time, 2x minus 7, and then our outside values together, x squared minus 5. So x squared minus 5, okay? And that problem's done. So let's go ahead and box it in. There it is, completely factored, all right? All right, let's try one more example. So here's my next example, a little bit different because I have a combination now of variables. I have x and y, and I even have this y squared over here, okay? But I do have 4 terms, so let's try to group them together. Group together the first 2, and then I'm going to group together the last 2. And then what can I pull out between my first 2 terms? I can pull out a 6 and a y. So 6y, and then in parentheses I'll have x, and then plus 2. What can I pull out between my last 2 terms? Well, it doesn't look like I can really pull out anything, but you always want to try to pull out something. So if you have to pull out a positive one or a negative one, that's what you have to do. So again, you always have to pull out something, even if it's a positive one or a negative one. So in this one here, I'll just pull out a positive one and see what happens. If I do that, I get 9x plus 8y squared. Now, what do you notice here? I do not have a common factor here. So as a result, I may not be able to factor by grouping. But before you jump to conclusions, maybe if you rearrange the original expression, we could get this to work, okay? So what I'm going to do here, I'm going to go ahead and just cross this out. This is not going to work. But if I go back to the original, could I possibly rearrange it so that it would work? Because remember, I'm adding all of these terms here. I can change the order. So why don't I go ahead and try to switch around 12y and 9x? Because I see that 9x and that 6xy look like they have something in common, and that may be a good grouping to go with. So I'm going to go ahead and rewrite it as 6xy, and then I'll have plus 9x, and then plus 12y, and then plus 8y squared. I like that grouping a lot better because I have y's in common over here, I have x's in common over here, and I also have numbers in common on both of those, right? So I like that grouping. We're going to go ahead and try it. So let's group together the first 2 and then the last 2. What can I pull out between the first 2? I can pull out a 3. I can also pull out an x, okay? That will leave me with 2y and then plus 3. Okay, there's that one. What can I pull out here? Well, it looks like they have a 4 in common and also a y. So plus 4y, and that will leave me with 2y and then plus 3. Okay, so you can see that that will work out. And so now I can write out the complete factorization. I write the common factor one time, 2y plus 3, and then the outside values together, 3x plus 4y. 3x plus 4y. Okay, and that's done. All right, so go ahead and box that in. There's the complete factorization of that expression, all right? So that's pretty much it. That is how you factor by grouping. Just remember, in order to factor by grouping, you have to have 4 terms. Now, if you do not get a common factor, that means you either did the problem wrong, the problem cannot be factored by using factoring by grouping, or you may have to rearrange the polynomial like we did here, okay? So again, just keep that in mind, and that's pretty much all there is to it. So if the video helped you in any way, or if you gained anything from the video, please go ahead and give it a thumbs up. Also, make sure you subscribe to the channel. That way you get more math videos in the future, and I'll see you in the next one.